In this chapter, we'll discuss the topic of mixing and mastering orchestral music. Obviously, this is a topic that could constitute an entire DVD on its own, but there are some fundamentals that we can cover here. Mixing and mastering orchestral music is very different in some ways to mixing and mastering modern electronic or pop music. In those fields, it is quite common for instruments to be loud and punchy, whereas in orchestral music, dynamics are critical. A typical problem is that compressing instruments can make them sound better and more attractive to the ear, but you are taking away the natural dynamics. And so it's important to avoid the temptation to make everything loud. If we listen to rock or pop music on the car radio compared to classical music in the same setting, then the rock and pop music will in general be compressed, and the difference between the quiet and the loud parts will be quite minimal. On a classical radio station, the quiet sections will be very hard to hear in comparison to the loudest sections. These are the dynamics at work. We have prepared a couple of examples here, and these are the examples from our epic trailer chapter. Our first example is the modern epic trailer example, which starts out relatively calm and builds towards the end of the piece of music. This example needs some careful compression to keep the dynamics between the quieter section at the beginning and the powerful section at the end, but still to enhance both sections. If we now look at our mixer, we can see that we have created groups for our instruments. So we'll only be mixing groups rather than independent instruments. What we have done with certain individual instruments, however, is EQ them and obviously adjust the level within the groups. As an example, we can look at the Albion spiccato instrument, which was a little bit too dominant in the higher frequencies. So we reduced some of those frequencies with an equalizer. They have only been reduced by a couple of dB, around the 5 kHz frequency, but often that is all that is required. So a small amount of work can be done on the individual tracks, just to make the individual libraries fit together somewhat better. But in general, this would be minor work. You would certainly want to avoid massive levels of equalization, especially in the world of orchestral libraries. The developers have obviously worked on creating realistic instruments, and fine-tuning them is totally normal, but too much processing will move them away from their natural characteristics. So one thing to remember when mixing orchestral instruments is that it is often just the finer details that need adjusting. What we can do is look at what is important, and we can start with panning. Are our instruments located how we want them to be located in the stereo panorama? Then we have the question of reverb. Obviously, using a high-quality, top-notch reverb will be better than using a perhaps less powerful but built-in reverb from one of your instruments. Of course, there are certain issues here. Some instruments have reverb built into the samples, and others are perhaps not able to remove the built-in artificial reverb that comes with the instrument. So finding a balance between the built-in reverbs and using a high-quality third-party reverb unit or plugin is important. The importance of reverb when creating a virtual orchestra mustn't be underestimated. You want to create a realistic ambience, and sometimes this can require finding just the right balance between settings. In this example, we have chosen to keep the reverb from the Albion string library, as it is a perfectly usable reverb. Now, if we look again at our mixer, we can see at the bottom of the mixer layout the separate groups. Amongst others, we have strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, cymbals, loops, etc. Not all of these groups are used here, however. We can see that on the first 4 groups, we have inserted a plugin that is called the Glue. This is a compressor plugin from a company called Cytomic. Each of these groups has been compressed, but very lightly. We are not trying to slam these groups, but as the plugin suggests, simply glue them together somewhat. Obviously, any quality compressor plugin will work, but it's important to use it correctly. So if we disable this compressor plugin, we can have a listen to our trailer with and without compression. So having listened, you can see that the compressor is being used extremely subtly. It is simply bringing the instruments together and giving them a touch more presence. At this point, you don't want to over-compress, especially if we take into consideration the fact that our mixed arrangement will also be mastered and will often be slightly compressed there as well. So once again, less is more. The next thing we can look at is the equalizing section. And yet again, we can see that we are using very subtle equalizer settings. All of our settings are within 1 or 2 decibels. So we can see that we are not creating large tonal changes in the instruments, but simply small adjustments to balance the fundamental tones of each instrument. We can also see in the master channel that I have a global equalizer, and this is removing a touch of the muddiness from the overall balance. As this is on the master channel, all of the instruments will be affected by this small adjustment of the frequencies between about 200 and 500 Hz. We also have a reverb that has been inserted on the loops group. The loops are not playing in our first example, however. So now I can activate all of the equalizers and plugins except for those on the master bus, and we can have a listen. One thing we noticed when listening is that nothing jumps out as having been processed. The last thing you want is for something to jump out. All we are trying to achieve is a better balance of levels and frequencies. Now we can look at the stereo out, or master bus, and the first thing I'd like to show you is a somewhat poor example of compression. So I'll activate a multiband compressor, and then I'll show you the damage that poor compression can create. The difficulty with this is that at the beginning it actually sounds better to our ears. It sounds louder and more present. But the moment we move on through the arrangement, we notice that when we have a lift in the dynamics previously, that lift is lacking as the elements have been squashed to the same level. And even worse, when we get to the most dynamic section later on, everything sounds squished together in an unpleasant way. The problem is our ears like volume, and simply slapping a compressor on the master bus and creating a louder sensation can trick us into thinking it is better, but we're actually creating a lack of dynamics. Now we can listen using a different compressor in a better way. We'll deactivate the multiband compressor and use a combination of the glue once again and the FabFilter Pro limiter. So now if we listen, we can hear that we have still brought everything up to the forefront to a certain extent, but there is still room for the dynamics to work. It sounds clearer and fresher, but still has the dynamics we need in orchestral music. The main thing to take from this is to be subtle and careful when using compressors. It's easy to ruin a perfectly good mix by too much compression and too much equalizing. Now let's look at our second trailer. Let's have a listen to it without any other additional processing. We can hear straight away that this is already a powerful trailer. At some point, we can switch all of our plugins in to compare. And we need to lower the level of the limiter somewhat, as it is peaking. So with this arrangement, we could already be somewhat more heavy-handed, as it's a loud arrangement from the start. Having said that, if we look at the stereo output, we haven't slammed it too much. There are still plenty of dynamics within our arrangement, and they have been kept. One thing to be careful about is the low end or bass. It is tempting to have extremely powerful lower frequencies, but these are tricky. In this example, I would probably choose to cut the low end a slight amount, as they are taking too much energy up in our arrangement. We can see this in the fab filter limiter, as every time the low end hits, the limiter has to react. So it's important to balance the bass properly. It has to be powerful, but it mustn't dominate a mix. Of course, you have the option to use the stereo bus equalizer to bring the overall low end down a touch. So in summing up, we would suggest that when creating your arrangement, you work with the instruments as they are without compression or equalizing, and in some cases keeping them as dry as possible. Obviously, some people prefer to play in with some reverb on the instrument, but to really hear what you are playing precisely, too much reverb can be a bad thing. If you feel the need and have the time, you can use a high-quality reverb on all of your strings. But you may have to spend that time going into each library and removing any reverb that is included. As we have mentioned previously, this may or may not be easy depending on the library. But to be honest, some libraries such as the Albion one have an excellent reverb built in, and this work is probably not really important for playing into your arrangement. The important thing when discussing equalization is that it is much more useful to reduce the harmful frequencies a touch than to boost the other frequencies to try and hide those harmful frequencies. With equalizing, cutting is almost always better than boosting. Of course, if you want an instrument to cut through slightly, then boosting a touch is fine. The main thing is to avoid large increases or decreases in frequencies. Then compression is another thing to be careful with. Our suggestion is to compress instrument groups, but very gently. Once again, there is no advantage in squashing every instrument so that they are lacking the dynamics you carefully created when building your arrangement. Also, if you feel the need to add reverb, then clearly it is advantageous to add reverb separately to strings in their own group, rather than to an entire mix. Then, when discussing the master bus, a touch of compression or a touch of equalization can be useful in taming the low end, or adding a touch of presence to the high end, for example. And a touch of limiting should be the maximum that you do. Of course, it is possible that certain projects will require more drastic work, and in some situations it may sound better with more extreme settings. But in general, the best thing is to use these tools carefully, so as not to damage your arrangement.